Hello, everybody, and welcome today to another edition of the ASLA Emerging Professionals Committee Ask Me Anything events. We are very excited that you're here with us today, and we are most excited about our special guest today. Today we have with us Mark Focht. He is a fellow of ASLA, and he is currently the Deputy Commissioner and Chief Operating Officer of New York City Parks. Mark, thank you for joining us today. We're happy to have you.
Thanks, Daniel. It's my pleasure.
I want to start off just by having you tell us your career path, how you ended up as COO of New York City Parks. That's kind of an interesting place, an exciting place for a landscape architect. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you ended up there.
Position here, I've only been with New York Parks about 4 months, so I started in January of this year. But I've been practicing landscape architecture for about 30 years. I have undergraduate and graduate degrees from Penn State and University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I spent about 10 years in the private sector with firms in Philadelphia. And then in the mid to late 1990s, I made a transition in my career and I moved into the nonprofit world. And I think we'll talk about this probably later, but I made a very conscious decision to move. I made a transition in my career, and we'll talk about that more. But I spent a few years in the nonprofit sector, but then my bulk of my career was 18 years with the city of Philadelphia, with Fairmount Park and Philadelphia Parks and Recreation. So I worked in the public sector. I spent my last 11 years there as first deputy commissioner of Parks and Recreation for Philadelphia, and then came here to New York to the brand new role of chief operating officer for New York City Parks and Rec, which is the largest parks and rec department in the nation. So it's a rather interesting and unique role for a landscape architect, but the majority of my career has been in the public sector.
All right. Sounds like a interesting career path. You are unique in some degree as a landscape architect working in the public sector. I mean, there are lots of them out there. Before we get to our 5 starting questions that we typically start with, let's just stay down this path. What do you see as the differences between the time you spent in private and public, and why do you feel strongly about working in the public sector?
Majority of landscape architects in the nation work in the private sector. According to ASLA statistics, probably over 85% of landscape architects work in the private sector. That's understandable. There's incredible career opportunities in the private sector. But that means a very small percentage of us work in the public sector. And what I hypothesized about in the late 90s and what I have found to be true over the last almost 2 decades is having a role as a landscape architect in the public sector is very meaningful. You have a seat at the table, you're part of a process that makes decisions on how resources or resources, basically money, is raised and allocated, and how you can put your skills as a landscape architect to work in the public realm, really enhancing the quality of the environment. And that could be physical built environment, not a natural environment that we as landscape architects are trained to work with, and that the majority of the public engages us. Really, and so I have found it to be exceedingly rewarding, and I've advocated very strongly for young landscape architects to consider a role in either the nonprofit sector or the public sector.
All right. I'm going to start off with our 6 questions. We made you aware every one of these events we do, we ask the same 6 questions of everybody. And it's interesting to see the scope and the breadth of the answers to these. So let's start off with number 1. If there was one thing you wish you could tell your younger landscape architect self, what would it be?
It's a great question, and I think I'm going to take liberties at the start here and say not one thing, but it's a combination of 2 things. It's not to be afraid to ask questions in whatever work setting you find yourself in, either it's a summer job or a full-time job as an emerging professional. Don't be afraid to ask questions of those around you. That's how you really learn. I think when you're new in any job, but certainly as a landscape architect, you may be a little intimidated by the setting, or you may feel that you don't know enough to ask questions. informative, of course, always in a really polite and professional manner, but don't be afraid to be aggressive. Ask your boss or your boss's boss or the owner of the company or the head of the agency you work for why something is the way it is or how a project came about, or even ask if you could, shadow someone when they go to a public meeting or go to meet a client, even if it's not a project you're involved in, just so you can learn more about the place you work, learn more about the agency or the policies. So I think if I could turn back the clock, I would tell my younger self to be a little bit more aggressive in asking questions and pursuing information.
That's a great answer. I am getting a little talk here that people are having trouble hearing you, Mark, so I'm working on figuring out a way to get your audio boosted a little bit.
Okay.
Maybe in the meantime, if you can speak up a tad, that might help. All right. Let's move on to our second question. We do have some questions coming in from the audience. Keep those coming and we'll get to them shortly. Our second question from our list: who or what has had the biggest impact on your career so far?
Well, there were certainly professors early on in my career at Penn State and at UMass that were really formative. And I think, if you're lucky, most people have those in their academic careers. That's not that unusual. For me, it was a formative event. About 10 years into my career, I was working very happily at Wallace Robertson Todd in Philadelphia, doing great land planning and design work. But after being in the profession about 10 years, I was growing increasingly frustrated that you were only ever the consultant. You were only ever advising folks on what the final outcome should be. You were never actually directly effectuating change. And just through a series of events about, like I said, year 9 or 10 in my career, the realism that if I wanted to really have the ability to affect change, again, particularly in the public environment, I had to transition my career from, as I've said many times, from one side of the table being being the consultant, to the other side of the table being the client. So really work myself into a position where I could engage landscape architects and other like-minded individuals and firms to do really exciting, high-quality work. So it was more the kind of dawning realism in about, years 9 or 10 into my career that I wanted to make that switch. And that probably, more than anything else, has shaped the last, 2 decades of my career.
All right. And what is your favorite thing about being a landscape architect? Obviously, you talk about being the client now. On that side, that's a little different. But as a landscape architect, what do you enjoy the most?
I think generally it's just a really fun profession. We're really in tune. Most landscape architects, as I've traveled and met with young practitioners and students, most of us have come to this career through a kind of circuitous path. Unfortunately, the knowledge of our profession in like elementary, middle, and high school is not as deep as we would all want it to be. So we kind of come to landscape architecture. I came to it through architecture, thinking I always wanted to be an architect, and then ended up, making a number of early career decisions to become a landscape architect. And I think it's a really fulfilling profession. I think we're uniquely trained to really work with people in their communities, to be consensus builders, to listen, and to reflect kind of the values that we hear. So the thing I like most about being a landscape architect is really engaging with the public.
All right. Then you definitely found yourself in the right spot for that.
Yes, most definitely.
Well done. All right. This is a question of some debate. We get a little bit of both. But in your opinion, hand drawing or computer graphics?
Well, I'm going to split it right down the middle. It really has to be a combination of both. I think that part of the art in landscape architecture is really hand drawing or hand conceptualizing and really understanding, not relying on technology, just relying on your hands and your own skills to really sketch out ideas. There's something just really beautiful about the texture of hand-drawn rendering. Technology is an amazing tool. It helps you in many different ways that can really help clients and the public understand what you as a designer are envisioning. because you have unique skills as a landscape architect to envision things the public doesn't. That's why we do what we do. So it really has to be a blend of both. I think it has to be full of really sensitive touch on hand-drawn and beautiful work, but then also not be afraid to use the technology. I think the one caution I have about the technology is sometimes I believe students and young practitioners get so the technology that the finished product, the renderings that are being shown look so realistic that decision on materials and other things are being made based upon technology and not so much based upon a really understanding of that material and an application of that material and having to really think about it if you had a hand-drawn construction detail of how that material would be installed. So I'm always a little cautious that some of these perspectives that we see with projects look so sophisticated and so finished that you can't tell a computer rendering sometimes from a photograph of the actual finished product. And that's where I get a little nervous about it. To me, that's crossing the line a little bit, a little too far into using technology.
Do you think there's a push from the client side for that technology?
I think in some cases there is, yes, but I also think that students and emerging practitioners, particularly when you're coming out of school, I've often said to students that academia leads practice, whether you're talking public practice or private practice. I'm sometimes worried that students coming out of school and young practitioners will be disappointed at the technology in offices, because technology is always leading at universities. And you come out, and I think it's the young practitioners, emerging practitioners' responsibility to push offices and push clients of using technology, because they generally know it better than their older peers in offices. So it's kind of I could see it both ways. They should push their offices and or agencies on using technology, but not letting it dominate.
All right. That was a great middle-of-the-road answer. They're both important. All right, moving on to our next question. Are there skills or traits that every landscape architect should have?
Yes, this is the easiest question because it's been the same to me for years. Communications, verbal communications and written communications. Yes, you need to be good at grading and drainage and computers and stormwater management and plant materials and everything else. But if you come to me to work at a firm or come to me to work at an agency, public agency like New York City Parks, I can make sure that you have the skill set that you need. I'm going to help you understand how we do things. What our palette of materials. You'll have to learn. You're educated at Penn State, but you move to Phoenix, Arizona, you're going to have to relearn the plant palette anyway. But I'm going to want a young landscape architect to be able to speak well, be confident in their speaking, be able to engage with lots of different people, be comfortable making public presentations, and be good at writing. But we still produce reports, still doing memos, even though everything's electronic, but you're still producing written documents that become, in some cases, legal or archival documents. 2 years ago, ASLA did a survey of practitioners, and it listed like 20-some things, and it asked practitioners to rank what they were looking for most in new hires, so recent college grads and first 5-year practitioners. And across the board, regardless of type or size or geographic location, written and verbal communication were the number 1 and 2 things that most practitioners look for. And I think it's absolutely critical.
Right, so it's one thing to be able to produce the work, but you need to be able to communicate the ideas and the concepts to internal and external.
Have to be able to sell it, literally sell it, and also just convince people about it, be passionate about it, talk intellectually but not over people about it, understand your audience, write well. Those are skills that I can't take time as your employer to teach you. Right. I can take time to teach you how we do grading or how we look at plant palettes or the types of paving stones we use at NYC Parks. But I'm never going to have the time to teach you how to be a good communicator. Right. I shouldn't have to.
And that communication goes both ways, the ability to listen to stakeholders and listen to the community.
Absolutely.
All right. So here's our Willy Wonka question. If you were to receive a golden ticket to visit any landscape in the world, where would you like to go?
I think it's a combination of two things. It's really urbanization. Um, our world is growing more populous in urban areas. We are urbanizing as a world. We see it in the United States, but all over the world. So I think any places that are urbanizing rapidly, and I put in there India, China, places like that, and also so kind of the urbanization mode. But then also I'm personally very interested in what's going on in Asia. In China, I was just with some colleagues last night, and there's the ASLA meeting, the Council of Educators in Landscape Architecture. This American organization is holding their annual meeting later on this month in early June in Beijing. They're holding it in China because in Beijing alone, there's over 6,000 landscape architecture students attending university just in the city of Beijing. So the rate at which landscape architects are being educated in Asia, particularly in China, is really fascinating for the profession. So if I could get that golden ticket, it would probably be to go to China and look at their growth, look at their education system. So that's how I would spend that first class golden ticket I'm going to get.
First class?
I don't know. It's a golden ticket.
It's true. All right, we are going to go to some audience questions, Mark, but I am still getting some messages coming up that people are having a hard time hearing you. I've got you boosted as much as possible here, so I guess the louder you can talk or closer to the mic, I guess, will be how we'll get to it. Apologize for the technical difficulties to you and to everybody else. All right, so we're going to start with a question from Michael D'Amico. He says, "Hi, Mark. As an emerging professional, I have always been drawn to public work, but it has been quite difficult to find an opening. Is it just a factor of time and being in the right place at the right time?"
Yes, it is a factor of time, although I will say that keep at it. I'm thrilled to hear that you're interested in the public sector. You really have to keep dogging the systems, reading. And so let me back up. Every public agency has to post all their jobs. So if you know the region of the country or the particular city that you're interested in living in, constantly check their websites, their employment websites, and they're updated here in New York. They're updated daily with the positions that we have. I know New York is a little anomalous because we're such a big agency in such a big city, but in Philadelphia, where I worked for so many years, we would post advertisements regularly if we had professional positions available. So the one great thing about working in the public sector is employment opportunities are always known to anybody if you go look at a city or agency website. Federal government, state government, local. It's different in the private sector. You're not necessarily going to know that a firm is looking for a young landscape architect. So my recommendations are always to keep checking websites, keep looking for the information, but also, attend events. Oftentimes, particularly cities have things like sustainability forums, public events, public speakers that are addressing urban issues or building or sustainability or resilience. Make sure you go to those, network. Certainly, if you're not already a member, join your local ASLA chapter and go to those chapter or sector events where you can meet more landscape architects. I mean, getting a job in the public sector is really no different than getting a job anywhere else. It's a lot about networking.
Michael. Next question comes from Carl Heinker. If I pronounce that right, Carl. I'm sorry, that's not a question, that's a comment. We're going to move to Joshua Wilcox. What is the role of landscape architecture in comprehensive land planning and community planning?
So I think there's two roles. One is definitely in the private sector. So many communities, cities are hiring private sector firms to do land plans, to do comprehensive plans. And when I worked for that 10 years in the private sector, I did a lot of land planning. So if that's something that you're interested in, land planning is often done by private sector firms, both for private developers that are doing large land development, and certainly for city agencies, or public agencies, I should say, state, federal, local, that hire landscape architects, land planners to do the work. If you come to work for a public agency, most public agencies' charges are to do large-scale planning and implementation, so construction or design. Again, here in New York or in Philadelphia or other cities I'm familiar with, there's landscape architects not only working in the Parks Department, but often working at planning commissions, sometimes at your water or utility department, oftentimes in, like if the city has a sustainability group or resiliency group, there's landscape architects working there. So if you have an interest in that kind of land planning or planning function, there's definitely a role for you in either side, in the public sector or the private sector.
All right. Our next question from Tumaj, I'm going to butcher this one, Tumaj, I'm sorry, Gordarznia. What is the major difference between Europe and US in field of landscape architecture for education and for work?
It's a great question. I mean, in the United States in particular, or in the Western nations, United States, Canada, Mexico, and Europe, the profession is more established. Obviously, in the United States, we've been around since the late 1800s. We're not a large profession per se when you compare us to our sister professions like architecture and others, but we're very well established, and we're generally well known, and we're in places that make decisions. In countries, and I've mentioned China, but also India, other emerging countries, newer. So it's kind of, it's in ways, my theory, I've heard many other people talk about this, landscape architecture, other emerging countries and regions of the world is almost where we were as a profession in the 1950s or 60s. So there may be 50, 60 years, then depending on how you look at it. But what's really exciting is that the work that's being done, again, you look at like Landscape Architecture Magazine or the ASLA Awards Program, the work that's being done in Asia and some of these emerging areas, South America, for example, is really cutting edge. It's really addressing deep environmental issues. So I hope I'm answering the question, but basically I think that the profession outside kind of the Western world is smaller, but growing at an exponential rate. It's growing much larger in those environments than it is in the Western world. And it's very, very aggressive in those other places, but it's not as well established as it is in the Western world. And I think that's the same for both student or as a practitioner. Again, I mentioned there's 6,000 students studying landscape architecture just in Beijing right now. I mean, that's a phenomenal number just in one city. So there's a lot of energy around that, and most of those programs are less than a decade old, where you look at some of our programs in the United States now that are over a century old. Harvard, Penn State, others have been around for 100 years. The majority of academic programs outside of the Western world is, 10 years old, maybe 20 years old.
Having traveled to a lot of schools over the course of your time with ASLA, which we'll get into that a little more in a bit, there seems to be a lot of Asian students attending programs here in the States, and more than likely going to go back to Asia to practice once they graduate. What do you think that's going to do to changing landscape architecture in that part of the world?
Well, there's definitely a hunger for like the American approach, or even just when I look at ASLA, I mentioned SEALA is having their meeting in Beijing. There's a lot of interest in Asia, but in China in particular, to understand how the Western world, particularly America, does landscape architecture, from everything from how we educate our students to how we regulate our programs, how we regulate our profession through licensure. So I think they're very interested in understanding. That doesn't mean they're going to copy, but they want to understand and mold their growth of their profession on basically learnings that we've had here. And the organizations that I'm aware of, including ASLA, SEALA, LAF, CLARB, have all been very gracious in sharing information with their counterparts in other nations to really help grow the profession internationally. And there's definitely a lot of Asian students that have come to America, and not just to the United States, but to Canada also, to study and then to take that knowledge base back. I think as programs in China and other Asian nations become more established, we'll see that change a little bit. More people will not come here, but they will have learned from, what is going on here, our teaching methods and our approach to design, and particularly sustainability and environmental issues.
All right, we're going to go back to some audience questions. This one is from Eliana. Do public sectors ever hire nonprofit landscape architecture organizations for public work?
Yes, we do. Both in my experience in Philadelphia and here in New York, I'll talk a little bit more about Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, we being Philadelphia Parks and Recreation, often partnered with nonprofit partners, and I can name at least 3 of them. The Trust for Public Lands, which is a national organization that had a Philadelphia office. The Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, which is the nation's oldest and largest horticultural society and did a lot of urban greening. And then our own Fairmont Parks Conservancy. Those are 3 nonprofits, all of whom employed landscape architects in the nonprofit organization. But through partnerships with Philadelphia Parks and Rec, we would give them contracts, we would pick sites, they would work in neighborhoods and community engagement to renovate recreation centers or playgrounds or small neighborhood parks. And it was a very efficient way for us as government to spend our resources supporting our nonprofit partners. We often raised money together from private foundations, and then that enabled them to pay their staff and then get projects done quicker than government might be able to. So yes, that's a very, very strong model I see being done here in New York, and it's basically being done all over the nation.
To a question from your fellow New Yorker, Jennifer Nitsky. Jennifer says, and this topic is very, very important to you, I know. How do you feel that landscape architects can best position themselves as leaders in green infrastructure projects?
I didn't even plant that question, but thank you, Jennifer. That's a great question. Yeah, I haven't really spoken much about it, but the focus of my career in Philadelphia for at least 11 years or so was really advancing green infrastructure, the Clean Water Act, and many other ecological and social and economic functions. I think landscape architects are uniquely suited to lead the charge on green infrastructure for a number of reasons. One, we are completely capable of understanding the technology and the calculus, the engineering of managing green infrastructure. We should never doubt ourselves on that. We understand how to manage stormwater. We understand grading and drainage. We get that. We can master that if we so choose. But then we also have the other 2 components. We understand plants and native systems. We understand how plants and vegetation, wildlife, how all the natural systems work. And then we understand the community component. We're really skilled at working in a consensus mode, building consensus, working with constituent groups. So if you put those 3 together, the design elements, the engineering elements, and the community-based knowledge and consensus building, I think the landscape architects are uniquely positioned to lead green infrastructure. So how do you do it? You have to just constantly advocate for it. If you're working in an agency, if you're working at a private sector firm, you have to make it be known that you're interested in green infrastructure, sustainability, resiliency, whatever the subject matter might be. Position yourself to be involved in those projects, on those teams, volunteer to go to conferences, educate yourself on it, demonstrate leadership, demonstrate initiative, and you will have some amazing assignments, and you will find yourself part of that critical conversation.
Great advice. Our next question, this is a long one, so bear with me, comes from Holly. Do you think landscape architects will become sites accredited professionals now more than seeking the lead accredited professional? And how important are these to landscape architects as part of their daily lexicon to be competitive in the job market when creating sustainable public or private environments, specifically using emerging greening technologies and green infrastructure.
Okay.
Got that?
Another great question. That right now, Leeds is such a powerhouse that I don't want to in any way underestimate the power and the position that a Leeds accreditation for professional earns you, particularly amongst our peers in architecture and other practicing professions. Sites is kind of the new kid on the block, and I was very involved in my leadership role at ASLA with getting sites, something I'm very proud of, and I advocate strongly for landscape architects to become sites accredited, but also to get Leeds accredited at the moment. They really are two separate programs. And if you're not familiar, sites is run by the Green Building Certification Institute, GBCI, the same organization that manages and implements Leeds. And now WELL is the Interior Building Criteria Program. So those three programs combined, Leeds, WELL, and sites, an incredible package of credentials on sustainability and environmental issues, outside, inside, building systems, everything. And because they're all run, so ASLA and our partners have licensed sites to GBCI, and GBCI is the one that's taking on the process of training, accreditation, licensing. And so, it's in their best interest and our best interest. There's not going to be a lot of duplication between Leeds and sites because they really are two different products. So my recommendation is if you're interested in Leeds, to pursue Leeds, but not at the exclusion of sites. Eventually, sites will build up. Our fervent hope is sites will build up to be as powerful as Leeds. But site is really about landscape architecture and site work. It's not as much about buildings.
All right. Another question from the audience. Any general notes or recommendations for the emerging professional, especially if they live in cities that may not have many landscape architecture events or talks?
Yes, I think you really need to broaden how you think about the profession. And I've often used the example of, getting involved in a neighborhood urban garden or a community greening initiative, or even in small plant towns that may still have street tree commissions, volunteering to be on your street tree commission. This is all part of growing the awareness of landscape architects, who we are, what we do, but it also begins to position yourself in a place with an organization. Again, if you're a volunteer shade tree commissioner, that you have authority and bring your knowledge to the table and you can help dictate or form and mold policy. So I fully appreciate not every city has a really robust, perhaps ASLA chapter. The other thing that I encourage you to do is there are so many programs in landscape architecture now. I think the last count there's about 97 programs in the United States in undergraduate and graduate programs combined. How about getting engaged with your local university, being a guest lecturer, or asking to go to meet with a professional practice class, or if not at a college level, maybe a community college level, or volunteering to go, if you have children, go into your son and daughter's school and talk about what you do as a landscape architect. So there's lots of ways to grow awareness of the profession, but also then to connect with other folks, because as I always say, you never know who knows another landscape architect.
True. All right. Okay, we're going to get slightly political.
Okay.
Do you feel the profession of landscape architecture is in jeopardy with the current administration, especially in light of the trending views on the environment?
A resounding no. I don't think we're threatened. We will only be threatened if we are passive and if we don't stand up for our values and don't really aggressively pursue kind of our ethics and our morals. And this is a great question, and I was hoping someone would actually ask the political question, because it's in almost every conversation I have now with students and with young practitioners. And without sugarcoating it, it's a difficult time right now for our profession, but I would say for our nation. If you hold a certain set of values that have to do with respect of the environment, respect of the individual, and hold a certain political or philosophical bent. It can be a challenging time. However, I think as we've seen in the general political environment, that the result of last November's election has really provided a spark to a new political movement of re-engaging young people in the political process. And I think it can do the same for us as landscape architects. I've said that I believe, whether or not we're talking about landscape architecture or economic equality or social equality, that in the 8 years of President Obama, we probably felt, I felt, and folks with similar ideas, felt that the nation and the world was going in the right, quote unquote, right direction. It felt good, it felt right. And to some extent, we probably took it a little bit for granted. The extraordinary movements that we made under President Obama on things like climate change, same-sex marriage, many other things, just felt right. I think the last November's election was a little wake-up call that we shouldn't become complacent, that we shouldn't assume everything's going to continue to go in the direction we might want it to. But at the same time, I think if you look back, not just over the last year, but over the last several decades, generally, we as a nation and a world are going in the quote-unquote right direction. I mean, we're working much more towards energy independence, towards respect of each other, towards sustainability, towards resiliency. So this is a challenging time for us all, but I don't think it will only negatively impact our profession if we let it do that.
That's true. It was exciting to see at the climate march a couple of weeks ago, about 100 landscape architects marching together with a very large ASLA sign.
Right.
Doing their part. All right, we're going to move on to our next question. And if anybody else has questions, viewers, please keep putting them in there. We've got time to cover plenty more, so feel free to ask away. All right, so the next question asks if New York City Parks works with the New York City Department of City Planning, and if so, is that a positive relationship?
Well, again, I've only been here about 3.5 months, so I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, but I will say from what I understand and what I've seen, the answer would be yes. Certainly, the city planning here in New York and in most other cities are responsible for authoring and kind of guiding master documents like comprehensive open space plan or the zoning code or the comprehensive plan or a sustainability plan for the entire city. And then oftentimes those documents are developed with substantial input from the city operating departments, including, transportation and water and parks and police and everybody. And then everyone has their piece of it to implement. And here in New York, we're responsible for about 14% of the city of New York, but a little shy of 30,000 acres. So when you talk about environmental issues, open space, we have an initiative here in New York, like many cities have, to get a park or open space within a 10-minute walk of all of our 8.5 million residents. And that's a large planning goal, and the department is largely the one responsible for achieving that goal. So again, based on my experience in other cities and what I've heard so far since I've been here, I would say the answer to that is yes.
Next question is education. Do you see an importance in pursuing a PhD in landscape architecture? Would one benefit more from remaining in practice or pursuing a degree?
It's a great question. I will say really that is such an individual decision. It really depends on what you want to do as a landscape architect. Certainly, if you want to teach, if you want to pursue an academic career or perhaps something in research, absolutely a PhD would be beneficial. I would say if you feel you want to practice, you want to build the majority of your career around practice, I don't believe it's necessary to have a PhD. Well, I will say it is not necessary to have a PhD to practice. Certainly, so many successful landscape architects have practiced with accredited bachelor's, undergraduate degrees. Some also have their master's degree. So, and until recently, and recently I'd say the last decade, when there started to become PhD programs, a master's degree in landscape architecture was considered the terminal degree as far as you could go. I taught as an adjunct for 21 years at Temple University in Philadelphia with a master's degree because when I started teaching in the late 80s, there were no PhD programs. So again, it's a really personal decision based upon where you see your career as a landscape architect going.
Right. Sticking with that education, you mentioned earlier kind of some of the disparity between technology at university and in the firms. Are there any other gaps or disparities you see between education and practice?
Well, there is, I will answer that in part with a story, which several years ago, I was on a panel to help Penn State think about a new curriculum. And, you know, we had a bunch of folks and we had working groups and we all sat around and constructed our ideal undergraduate program. And at the end of like a 3-hour breakout session, we were very proud to present to the head of the program the first 8-year undergraduate program, because we felt that there was so much that landscape architects should know in an education, but the reality and the practicality is you can never teach everything. This is such a diverse profession, and depending on what you do with it, you know, you may not get the full education you need in an academic setting, and then you need to get it another way. Maybe another degree. We just talked about going for a master's or a doctoral, or maybe just a work experience. So I think there's actually, you know, quite a few things. I think most accredited programs in landscape architecture don't give students enough business skills if you want to work at a private sector firm or eventually have your own firm. I don't think they give enough practical experience in working in the government sector. So I think there are gaps in education, but that's not really a criticism. It's just an acknowledgement that there's no way that you could ever educate a student in landscape architecture, everything this profession embodies, unless you want to spend, you know, the first decade, unless you want to spend your entire 20s going to school, which most people don't.
Yeah. All right. I want to segue a little bit into the American Society of Landscape Architects, ASLA. You have been very heavily involved there, served recently as president. Tell us a little bit about your experience. When you got involved in ASLA, what led you to become more involved, and until you got to the ultimate position, I guess, and why it's important to you in your career.
Well, ASLA, and I will preface this, and it won't be probably surprising to anyone that's listening to me. I mean, I'm very biased and pro ASLA. I did have the great honor to serve as president of the society in 2014. I started out at the local level when I was a young practitioner in Philadelphia. I was a member of the Pennsylvania-Delaware chapter. I volunteered on committees, and I spent a decade plus working at the local level. And then in 2008, we hosted the annual meeting in Philadelphia, and I was co-chair of the host committee. And after that, I just started to really become engaged with the national staff and national leadership, and an opportunity presented itself to serve as vice president of communications in 2010 and 11. And so I was elected to that role, which was a huge honor. That's when we were redesigning Landscape Architecture Magazine. Brad McKee had come on board. We were redoing the website. So that was a very exciting time for ASLA. And then shortly after ending my 2-year term as vice president, I was elected as president. So I think that the importance of ASLA is the world's, not the nation, but the world's largest and oldest professional association representing our professional landscape architecture. Established in 1899, we have over 16,000 members, 48 full-time staff members at our headquarters in Washington, D.C. that do an absolutely amazing job, considering I think currently only 3 or 4 of them are actually educated in landscape architecture. They otherwise have, you know, marketing, finance, human resources, politics, political science, all kinds of backgrounds, but they're really committed to our profession. We have considering our relatively small size, we have a very, very strong power and presence on Capitol Hill informing legislation. And going back to the earlier question, which is even more critical in this administration than in past administrations. And it is what it is. It is the only only association representing our profession. So I think it's critical as students to join your student chapter and then parlay that into being an ASLA member all the way up. And, you know, the The association comes under criticism at times justified for things we do or do not do, but I have a relatively thin skin for criticism from either landscape architects that aren't even members of ASLA, so they're not dues-paying members, but they still look to us to represent their profession, or even landscape architects that are members of ASLA but haven't volunteered or helped supported the association in some way. And again, that can be anything from volunteering on your local committee, your local chapter or section, or your local organization, all the way up to possibly being president of the society.
Just segue into a question that just came in. How important is it for student chapters to get involved and engage with professional chapters? What is the best way to create?
Another great question. I think it's really critical for student chapters to establish a strong communications link to your state chapter or your local chapter. For many reasons. I think it runs both ways. It's clearly helpful for students in a student chapter to be engaged with practitioners. And going back to an earlier question about as an emerging practitioner, how do you find your way in the profession? How do you make those connections? One great way is through the chapter. So if you're a student or a recent graduate and you can engage with a student chapter, a lot of state chapters, ASLA chapters, have great state annual meetings. Pennsylvania, Delaware does, New York does, New Jersey does. And they're often looking for students to help volunteer at the events. You often don't have to pay any registration, but if you're willing to be a room monitor for an ed session, we even do that at the national annual meeting. This year it'll be in Los Angeles, next year in Philadelphia. So there's often ways to engage, and it gives you the opportunity to meet with professionals and interact with them and really learn from them. So I think it's great for the students. Conversely, it's great for the practitioners because, again, the students will bring, or emerging practitioners will bring, younger, fresher ideas, new ideas on how to do things, certainly generally more comfortable with technology and outreach and engagement. What your generation, whatever your generation is interested in and what attracts them. So I think it's really critical. Some chapters have done a great job. Some chapters have actually created a seat on their executive board as a liaison between the chapter and, if you're fortunate enough, for example, in Philadelphia, we had 5 programs of landscape architecture, which was really unusual. But so we had liaisons to all the different universities that had accredited programs in and around Philadelphia. And if you're involved in your student chapter and your professional chapter doesn't have that, reach out to them and try and establish that. And frankly, if you don't get traction at the state chapter, talk to folks at National, talk to the staff at National that can often help situations.
Great response. There's definitely lots of ways to get involved. Just start that contact, I think, and go from there. Yep. Next question, does ASLA interface at all with other professional organizations like the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects to work together on things like climate resilience?
Yes, so 2 levels. So let me answer that in actually 3 ways. One thing is ASLA is very engaged with all of our sister related American professional organizations. So literally right now as we're sitting on this conversation, the American Planning Association, the APA, is having their national meeting here in New York. The leadership of ASLA is here, attending the APA conference and having high-level conversations with APA. So between it's APA, AIA, the American Institute of Architects, ASLA, ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers. So planners, architects, landscape architects, and civil engineers. We form something called the President's Council, where once a year the highest level leadership of all those organizations get together and talk about allied interests, challenges, opportunities, but then also on a very regular basis the staffs of all the professional associations. That's specifically to America, the United States. Similarly, all the landscape architectural organizations in the United States. So CELA, I've already mentioned, Council of Educators of Landscape Architecture, ASLA, CLARE, the Landscape Architecture Foundation, the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, IFLA, the International Federation of Landscape Architects. Once a year, that leadership gets together. And right now, their focus is on diversity in the profession, something that we've been talking about for decades. trying to work on is growing the diversity in the landscape architecture professions through each of our respective organizations. So right now the focus is on diversity. In the past, it's been on resiliency, it's been on climate change, it's been on sustainability. But the focus for 2016 and 17 is kind of a 2-year focus, is diversity of the profession. But yeah, that's kind of an international focus.
All right. One more question. I am a young professional and I'm working on getting my license. Would it benefit me to try to acquire an office in my local chapter? Be elected to office in the local chapter?
Well, thank you for the question about licensing. I was hoping someone would ask this. So let me just talk about licensing for a moment, then I'll connect it to the chapter. As a young practitioner in landscape architecture, I think other than, having a job and sustaining your life, your second most important responsibility is to become licensed. And I often use the example, and I didn't originate this example, but you would probably, nor should you, go to an unlicensed doctor or have your taxes done by an unlicensed accountant, or if you have to be represented in a court of law, be represented by an unlicensed lawyer. So our society establishes respect and expectations and accountability based upon this property and welfare of citizens. We should be licensed. So there's no reason that a landscape architect should not pursue licensure. I just feel so strongly about that. The only way that we will continue to grow in authority and power is to be licensed. Again, we're small in number. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates there's about 30,000 in the nation. There are about 26,000 on the different licensing registrars in all 50 states. ASLA has about 16,000, 17,000 members. We spent a decade at ASLA working to get licensure laws passed in all 50 states, and we're just getting it passed in the District of Columbia. So the first time in the history of the profession, we will be licensed in all 50 states plus DC. There's a decade worth of work to get that passed, and we're constantly protecting it. So it's critically important that you become a licensed landscape architect. And that often, when I talk to students and young practitioners, that often should inform how your career develops. It's often almost easier to become licensed to go to work in the private sector, work for a licensed landscape architect, work in an office, get the whole skill set to take the exam and pass the exam, perhaps before you move on to a nonprofit or public sector work. As far as tying it to ASLA membership, please keep in mind that there's no connection between licensure and membership in ASLA. It's different than some of our sister organizations that do tie licensure and membership. We had a really robust conversation a few years ago when I was president of ASLA about whether or not licensure and membership should be tied together. There were strong opinions on either side, but in the end, there was a pretty strong majority that wanted to stick with the fact that the two are not tied together. So while it's great that that as a leader in whatever level landscape architect of ASLA you might aspire to, you are licensed, but it's certainly not a requirement, and it can never be held up as a reason that you can't hold office.
All right. Next question, and this might be our last one, maybe one more after this. What are your thoughts about getting students into programs? It seems university program numbers are dwindling. How do we promote the profession to the next generation?
Yeah, it's another great question. It's a responsibility of all of us, and there's just kind of been a thread in this conversation. I hope you have a sense of it, that I'm very passionate, and we really need to constantly raise the awareness of the profession. We have to be out there. We have to be volunteering. I mentioned your Shade Tree Committee. You have to work on ASLA. We're going to grow our numbers by growing awareness of the profession. You're going to grow awareness of the profession by starting in the schools. We used to think a decade or so ago that you had to start at high schools. The growing sense is that it's, if you just target high school students, that there's more initiative to target elementary schools and even middle school students when they're really in their formative stages. In the April issue of Landscape Architecture magazine, if you may recall, if you received LAM, there was a separate document that was produced by the staff, which was really awesome. It came out in April because April was World Landscape Architecture Month, And it was targeted specifically to helping elementary school kids understand our profession. And if you go online, there's lots of resources made available for free from ASLA, teaching guides, fun projects that students can do. And we really need to start out by getting into the school system, engaging younger kids and helping them understand. I mentioned earlier, I know this is generally an audience of younger landscape architects, but if you are a parent or you have a young child, going into their school for career day and talking about, what my mommy and daddy are a landscape architect and what that means, it's really incumbent upon all of us to do something like that to help grow the awareness of the profession. You're right, let me back up. You're right, the numbers are dwindling. I will say that it's a little less, it was never at a crisis mode, but when I was president in 2014 into 15, the numbers were looking pretty challenging. And the sense was that the numbers, by meaning the number of folks enrolling in programs, the numbers have started to climb back up. So most academic programs are reporting a rebound in the number of applications for undergraduate and graduate programs. So whatever may have caused that bottom out, and it may have been most people attributed to kind of a hangover from in 2009, 10, 11. But the numbers are looking better. We still have to grow them, and they're not growing at the way they were growing pre-2007. They're not growing at that clip, but they've stopped shrinking.
All right, and in closing, I just want to ask you something that was important to you during your time as president is about to become reality. The Center for Landscape Architecture is having its official grand opening next week. Talk about why that was important to you and what that's going to do for the profession.
So for those that you're not aware, Daniel is referencing the Center for Landscape Architecture is a new facility in Washington, D.C. That's a renovation of ASLA's headquarters. So ASLA bought a building in the 1990s in the Chinatown section of D.C. when it was not a great neighborhood. We made a very, very wise investment for a small organization, and we own our own building, which Washington, D.C. is now one of the hottest real estate markets in the nation, and we could never afford to buy a building today. So we're very well suited from that from a financial perspective. But the building was looking very stuck in the 1990s. It wasn't kind of an open concept. It was kind of a closed off storefront. It wasn't really showing our profession in the best light. So while I was president, I advocated and cajoled and arm twist and got a lot of folks engaged in a significant fundraising campaign. And 2.5 years later, next week, we'll be cutting the ribbon on the new Center for Landscape Architecture. So we rebranded the whole facility. It's not just about the headquarters of ASLA. It's about hosting outside events, allied organizations and professions. The whole facade of the building's been redone with a new glass facade. So anybody that walks by, we're on a busy commercial high street between 6th and 7th in DC. You can see right in. We're going to have rotating exhibits, speakers, and it's already being used. The National Building Museum has already leased out the space to hold seminars in it. So we're literally both physically and kind of psychologically opening our space as landscape architects to all of our allied professions. Interestingly, there's a number of committees on Capitol Hill in Congress that love the green roof on our building and our headquarters building in the late 1990s, designed by Michael Van Valkenburg. We have an incredible green roof, well before folks were doing green roofs. And so the combination of the green roof and now this really transparent green building, it's well and sites will really speak well for our profession. So if you're ever in DC, just please drop by 676 I Street Northwest.
All right, it is a beautiful space and going to do wonderful things for promoting landscape architecture.
Yep.
All right, well, we are at the top of the hour. So I'm going to give you just a moment to any closing comments or thoughts you have, and then we'll close it down.
Well, I want to thank Daniel and the emerging practitioners and professionals and ASLA for facilitating this whole, not just this talk, but the whole concept of these talks. Thank you all for tuning in and for your great questions. Clearly, you're thinking about the stuff that's important to the profession. And if you're ever in New York, look me up. I know at least one of you is in New York. Please just continue to be involved in the profession, ASLA, your community, and think positive and do great things. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Mark, for your time. And thank you to all of us for joining us. We apologize for any technical difficulties we had today. We'll try to make sure those are all corrected for next time. And next time will be the second Tuesday of June. And we will be announcing our guests soon, so stay tuned to all of ASLA's social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and you will be in the loop on what's going on. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next